Today's scripture reading brings us to 1 Samuel chapter 30. At this point in time, David has been dismissed from the Philistine army, and he heads back to Ziklag, which is where he's made his home in Philistine territory for about a year and 4 months. And he comes back to a very tragic situation. The Amalekites have raided and destroyed the city, and that's not all. So I'm going to just show you this. In I have this chapter broken down into 3 sections, verses 1 through 6. I have that titled, David Returns to Ziklag, Burned and Barren. So David returns, him and his men, and they see not only is the city burned with fire, but they have taken their wives and their children. David's 2 wives mentioned specifically here as well, but all their wives and all children. So they go back and they see what's happened, and they are grieving. And it's amazing. Their grief is so great that we see there in verse number 6, David was greatly distressed, for the people spake of stoning him. These people were so upset that they were going to kill their leader, which that would have solved nothing, So I don't know, but either way, sometimes when tragedy happens, we don't think clearly, and this is, I believe, what was happening there. But we see this in verse number 6. I want you to notice this. And David was greatly distressed, for the people spake of stoning him, because the soul of the people was grieved, every man for his sons and for his daughters. But David encouraged himself in the Lord. Now the question is, how do you encourage yourself in the Lord? Well, I'm glad you asked. I'm going to give you a couple answers to that right now. Number 1, you remember. You remember what God has done. David was able to look back and see how God had delivered him from a lion and a bear and a giant. David was able to look back and see how God had delivered him from the wrath of the king multiple times. So David remembered all that what God hath done. And in the second thing, if you want to encourage yourself in the Lord, remember all that God hath promised. And David remembered he was going to be king, and that he had a God that was faithful unto him. If you want to encourage yourself, then remember. So we see that there. Verses 7 through 20, I have that titled, David Pursues and Recovers That Which Was Lost. Now, the reason I titled it this way is because as I got to thinking about what David did here, it reminded me of Christ, how Jesus came to seek and to save that which was lost. Well, David pursues after that which was lost in a unrestrained manner, and he recovers them all. And I'm so thankful for that. Christ came after me in an unrestrained manner. Reckless abandon is the way Christ sought me out and saved me gloriously. So anyway, there's that. In this chapter, notice a few things, and that is David shows great wisdom here at the beginning, because David, his first instinct after encouraging himself is to seek God's will. God, what would you have me to do? And so he calls for Abiathar the priest and the ephod, and it says that David inquires of the Lord, and the Lord answers and says, Pursue, for thou shalt surely overtake them, and without fail recover all. And that's what God said. And you see this time, he didn't need God to tell him twice. David consults the Lord, very wise that he did that. And then also, as they go pursuing, his army's 600 men, but when they get to the brook Besor, the army dwindles. 2/3 or a third of them have, because they are so faint, they are so tired, they cannot make the pursuit any longer. They have to stay. And so David is going now with 400 men. Now notice this. David did not say, do I have enough people to go? And even when this happened, when his army was cut by a third, David did not say, Abiathar, where you at? Abiathar, that's his name. I'm sorry, I was mispronouncing that. Abiathar, where you at? I need that ephod. Things have changed here. No. See, God knew that the army would dwindle. David trusted God, and so David just pursued. They run into an Egyptian servant who was left there by the Amalekites because he was sick. They nourish him back to health, and they make a deal with him. Says, can you tell us where they're at? He says, well, I'll tell you, but you can't. You got to promise you ain't going to kill me and you're not going to send me back to them. They do that, and then they come upon the camp, and they're celebrating. Man, they're just having a dandy old time down there. We see that in verse number 16. Brought them down, behold, they were spread abroad upon all the earth, eating and drinking and dancing, because of the great spoil they had taken out of the land of the Philistines and out of the land of Judah. Now, one thing that I thought about as I read these verses 16 and then 17, was that the Amalekites were an image of so many souls today. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. They are not considering anything but the pleasure that they can enjoy for themselves. And they know not that that night and through on the next day, they would all be wiped out. So some of them that were eating and drinking, their death came almost instantaneously. The rest of them were dead except for the 400 that took off on camels. The rest of them were dead before the next day was out. You never know. You never know when you're going to leave this earth. You got to be ready. So, and one thing that really begs the question is, how big was this army? 400 fled. That's the size of David's entire army. 400 of them fled. I have no idea how many were actually there, but that was mentioned as just 400 men, right? There escaped not a man of them, save 400 young men, which rode upon camels and fled. So it was a great slaughter that David had perpetrated upon the Amalekites there. And then they gained the spoil. In verse number 20, it says this, and David took all the spoils of the herds which they drave before those other cattle and said, this is David's spoil. Now, that's not David claiming it for himself. That is David is going to usher out and divvy out these spoils. It's not going to be every man for himself. David's going to say who gets what. And that's important as we move forward, because the next portion of Scripture, and the last one, is verses 21 through 23, and that is titled, David Divides the Spoils of War. So they go back to the brook of Besor, and they see to reunite with the other 200. They got the 400, they got the women and children, they got all the spoils of war, and they all come upon the 200 that were too faint to continue the pursuit. And you have some of the wicked men, it says there, in the men of Belial, that didn't want to give those 200 anything except for their women and children. So they didn't fight. They ain't getting nothing. And David said, no, we ain't doing that. And the reason why is given there in verse number 23. Then said David, ye shall not do so, my brethren, with that which the Lord hath given us, who hath preserved us and delivered the company that came against us into our land. In other words, these men were saying they did not go fight. They do not get what we get. We went to go fight, they didn't, so therefore we get it and they don't. But what David is saying is, no, God gave it to us. God gave us the victory. You didn't win the victory, and they didn't lose the victory. God gave the victory, and so therefore we're dividing it all out even. That was the way David had established it, and that's the way it would go moving forward. And then the remainder of the chapter, you see that David took not only the spoils of war and divvied it among his men, but then he started sending it to the children of Judah, the city south of in Judah there, where David had been hiding himself out a lot. He sent the spoils of war to them as well. So that is 1 Samuel chapter 30. We got one more chapter left to go in this book that begins to tell us the story of the time the children of Israel went from the theocracy to the monarchy, and it's just been a wonderful study, I think, and I hope you do as well, and I hope he's been a help unto you. So, Lord willing, we'll see you for the last one.